Jazeera or something like that to know about it, right? I mean, so it is. It's really the continuation of these wars is really quite sickening.
So I want to circulate back to something you said a while ago, and you specifically. Do you remember in 2010, 2011, a report by Congress came out called Warlord Inc. And it was all about,
Yes.
sort of, you said earlier, with basically America privatized all their supply routes to get,
Yep.
ammo, fuel, food, basically everything, because they didn't want to do what the Soviets did, where they used their army and it turns out into war zones because there's these warlords that control different highways. And it's basically saying everyone was getting paid off along the way. So
Right.
the governor of the province, the region, police, army would set up checkpoints. Everyone basically, it was racketeering, and he compared it. He said Tony Soprano would have been proud. And I actually watched one of the hearings. So it was really interesting to listen to. I actually did a couple videos on it myself when I first made the channel. One of the best videos, but I would recommend reading the report. Could you touch on what you saw there? Because there was direct allegations the money was going to the Taliban, and anytime there was a big aid project going on, there's millions and billions going to these projects, they would siphon off the money. Could you talk about your personal experience with that, please?
Sure, yeah, and I would encourage people to go back and read what the reporting done by Azmat Khan, Anand Gopal, and Matt Akins over the last year or so. And particularly people like Azmat and Anand, who spent a lot of time in southern Afghanistan as the Taliban were winning in those final months there and taking the provinces. And what they saw, and you have this, and you start seeing it pop up in the months in October of last year or so, when they're still talking about the Afghan war in the New York Times and the Post, this acknowledgement of the outright banditry that everyone had to experience, the checkpoints where you had to go through police checkpoint after police checkpoint, where you're going to be shaken down, where you got to give them money. And this happened all throughout. This is what we talk about, the predatory kleptocracy that people were living under. That was the American and British and German and NATO project in Afghanistan. That's just what it was, and so. But no, this one, I want to just touch on the privatization of the war and what it allows for the American government to do and for the British government and others to do. Most people don't realize this, but more contractors were killed in the war than uniformed military members. So for the Americans, and you can't really pull up the total number killed in both Iraq and Afghanistan was over 7,000, but there were more than 8,000 contractors killed, right? So and those were all.
Sorry, what companies were these? So they only. I'm only familiar with a few private contractors. So the big one is Blackwater, obviously DynCorp, but from there, I don't know too many more personally.
Oh my God, there's so many. Tetra Tech, Halliburton, of course, is a big name. But DynCorp, Fluor, the RTI, the number, we could be here through tomorrow reading off the list of companies that profited from these wars. Anyone and anyone could be involved. And it was just, again, part of the neoliberal project, but both our countries have been experiencing for the last 50 years, right? The outsourcing of our government, the profit taking wherever profits can be made. And certainly that was seen with the American military. Was why should we have soldiers driving these trucks? Why should we have soldiers running generators? Why should we have soldiers, manning the chow halls? We can have private contractors do that. And, they make up the story about how it's going to save money. And of course it doesn't. It costs twice as much or more, but what you have, though, the benefit, though, is that it hides a lot of things. So those 8,000 people that were killed, many of them were non-Americans. Many of them were what we call TCNs, third country nationals. So people from Pakistan, people from India, people from Bangladesh, people from the Philippines, those tended to be the countries that had a lot of populations among the contractors. And, but they were all doing jobs that in Vietnam, say, would have been done by a service member, by someone in uniform. They would have been driving the truck, a soldier, would have been driving a truck, not a contractor. So, really hid the cost of the wars quite dramatically. But, this one of the things that's peculiar about Afghanistan, I think people have to remember, is it's landlocked.
Yeah.
And how do you get in then? Well, where are the ports? Well, the only ports really are two places, Iran and Pakistan. And Iran's not going to work, of course, right? For a lot of, we do a whole other show on that, right? We do a whole other show on Iran.
Yeah.
But then, you can fly things in, but you can only fly so much in. You can fly a lot more into, but so you got to bring it in by ship to Pakistan, and you got to truck it up and over the mountains and everything. So you're just looking at this, like, again, $300 million a day, 250,000 man army in Afghanistan you got to support by trucking it in. And of course, they're going to have all these opportunities to shake you down. But then, too, the other aspects of it where the profit taking, who do we put into power? We put into power warlords and drug lords. Of course, they were going to take their cuts. Of course they were. Why would we think otherwise? And so, again, one successive deployment, one successive group of American generals and colonels and British generals and colonels and Dutch generals and colonels after another just looked the other way. 20 some odd iterations of that where they knew this was going on. They just looked the other way. And, you would look at it. So when I was there, you would go out and you be among, go out to these little bases that we'd have out in the districts, and there might be there'd be American platoon there. That lieutenant would have 25 soldiers or so. And then there'd be like kind of a Afghan platoon there as well. So maybe an equivalent amount of Afghan soldiers. And you'd talk to that lieutenant about the situation, and you knew what was going on in that district. And you'd say, what do you control? And he would say, quite honestly, he'd say, the only thing I can control are what my machine guns hit. So basically anything I have line of sight of their little base was controlled by the insurgency. You can't even rightly call it the Taliban, because that's a misnomer for how the insurgency actually worked. In terms of like the Quetta-Shura Taliban being in Pakistan, being like the National Liberation Movement, that's not really who these insurgent groups were on the local level. But, so you'd look at this and you'd say, okay, well, how come you don't get overrun? It'd be very easy for them to mass and overrun you. We would never be able to get reinforcements to you in time. Never. Why doesn't it happen? So what you come to is the realization, two things. One, our air power. They don't want to mass because then they become vulnerable to our attack aircraft and our helicopters. But the other thing, too, is that the more important thing, I believe, is these things were a fountain of money. That lieutenant, besides having his 25 soldiers and 25 Afghan soldiers or whatever, he got about $1 million a year to spend in that district. Now, that district in Afghanistan is among one of the most poorest places in the world. Probably in the last 200, 300 years, if you were to aggregate all the wealth in that district, it wouldn't add up to $1 million. And now you've got a 24-year-old American lieutenant who has this money to go and spend to build schools, dig wells, do whatever. Well, who do you think, this is where you get to the point about who is benefiting from all this? Mm-hmm. Insurgency knew this. Why are you going to overrun and one risk that now the Americans are really going to come in fourth and you got to deal with that? All you got to deal with is this 24-year-old and his 50 men. You can handle that, and you don't have to worry about the air power coming in, you guys getting bombed, everything. But also, too, if you were to do that, it's a chance you're going to lose that $1 million a year or $2 million a year or $3 million a year, whatever we were spending in those districts. And so you look at that, you just say, my God, we were just basically providing cash to the insurgency over and over again. And certainly everyone was related, everyone was connected. As I said earlier, example I use is the school person who was in charge of the schools, but there are many examples I could use to describe that, and that was, everyone was getting their cut. The Afghans would say things to you like, we call this the golden age because now's the time to get the gold. And the whole thing was a wash, and everyone was making out. Everyone was earning money. As I said before, one of the 3 or 4 biggest sources of income for the Taliban was not the drug trade, but the contracts that the West, that NATO was spending over there. And so I think all those aspects of it made it just an absolute, this was an orgy for thieves, if you will. Where people got absolutely, and the Afghan government, of course, whatever the Taliban got, it was minimal compared to what the Afghan government took. and the billions of dollars that were leaving Afghanistan every year in cash, the billions of dollars that were leaving in cash, again, well known. Front page stories in the Washington Post about how they're trying to, the U.S. Treasury Department's installing money detectors at the Kabul airport to try and track the amount of money leaving the country because it's mounting into billions.
It was going to the UAE, so I remember seeing
Right.
articles in, I think it was the Washington Post, like suitcases of cash going to Dubai and the UAE. And wasn't there a whole scandal with the Kabul bank in 2011?
Yep.
Yeah. Could you?
Yeah, the money just kind of vanished. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and so I mean, one of my favorite stories is, and this is, we know this thanks to WikiLeaks. Oh shoot, what's his first name? But Massoud, Vice President Massoud. So the Vice President of Afghanistan showed up in Dubai with $50 million in his suitcases. I mean, just traveled there like that. With $50 million. I mean, like, so the amount of money, and it all went offshore. And so where did these people go? And the stories about Ashraf Ghani fleeing in August of 2021, how he had however much. And I know they've done some work. The Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction on the American side has looked into it. Yeah, and it doesn't seem likely that he took as much money as people were saying he did. Though I'm pretty sure he took some, So, but like, yeah, so where did it all go? And it went, as you said, to, to the Gulf, to Afghan government officials and generals were buying apartment buildings, not apartments, apartment buildings in Dubai. Right. I mean, so like, yeah, I mean, a lot of people got rich, a lot of people got wealthy, but the American aspect of this, I'm not too sure about how it worked with like your DFID and everything in Britain, but certainly the corruption on the American side. So it was immense. I mean, like the number of people who in the United States now own second homes and drive BMW M3s or M5s now because of this war, is legion. And you had the aspects of like when the American government would when the American Congress would appropriate billions of dollars for Iraqi reconstruction or Afghan reconstruction, the estimate is about 40% of that never leaves in the United States. Never. I mean, like that's the overhead cost that goes right to the American contractors right away. 40%. Yeah, and then it starts to get, then you got to pay for security, and then you got subcontractors, and that's why the estimate was that on the ground there, only about 10% of every dollar the American Congress appropriated actually made it to building a school or what have you. And then, as we know, because again, reporting by things by a Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, but also journalists like Azmat Khan, we know that 80 to 90% of the things that the American government, that its counterpart, the DFID counterpart, USAID, that it claims it built, can't be found. So journalists or American inspectors have gone out looking for these schools or these healthcare centers that were supposed to be built. They don't exist. They can't be found.
Yeah, there was loads of that in the Afghan papers when they was talking about all these projects. And they're trying to give like electricity to these rural tribal towns that have never had it, so they don't join the Taliban and we can win their hearts and minds. And there was all these projects. I think there's one with a dam, and then it just doesn't exist. The money just went away, and basically they were saying Congress was just give us this money, and no DOD official is going to say, well, we don't need that much.
Right.
It's back. They're just going to spend it, and it basically inspired. No one really trying to come up with real ideas. It was just like ideas that just, here's some money for that. Here's some money, because no one really has to think about it, because you're not like, the budget's a bit low, so we need to be careful. They're just like bags of money just going around everywhere.
Well, and the money you spent was a metric in and of itself. So if you spent more than the previous guy, you were doing better. Right. I mean, that was the metric, and the American military had came up with this idea of a doctrine, basically money as a weapon system. Right.
Yeah.
It was non-kinetic, as they called it. Kinetic, you shoot somebody, you give them money. It's non-kinetic, I guess, but the idea that you're going to, and I did this is what I was doing in Iraq, trying to use all that money I had to try and buy loyalty, to try and buy allegiance. And, I mean, it just doesn't work. It's against human nature. It's against who we are. It's against all our, particularly say like our origin stories here in the U.S. about, about our revolution and everything else. Like why, why would you think it would work? And we did, and it didn't work. And in many ways it aggravated the war and escalated the wars. But you had things where, like I say, a city I was in Zabul, Kalat, they built a diesel electrical generation facility without any thought to, one, how they'd ever get the diesel to the facility or how the diesel would ever be paid for. So they build this diesel generation electrification plant, and it barely runs. It runs for a few hours a day, but then that gets trumpeted as a triumph. The same thing too. We had this project where they went around, they put these radio antennas all throughout the country. And I remember writing up about this because it was established in our province. But the problem was there was no fuel to run the generator to power the antenna. There was no material to put on the antenna, right? So what are you going to broadcast, right? There was no way to record material to broadcast. This is 2009, so things now be easy to do, right? But we didn't have that then, and then more importantly, I think the Afghan population didn't have radios. I mean, but what gets reported back to so I send this up and say, hey, okay, the antennas got put up, but again, no fuel to run them, no material to put them on, no ability to record material, and the Afghans don't have radios. And what gets sent back to Washington, D.C., smashing success. The antennas are up. We're going to win this like a lot. Here comes Hearts and Minds just going to be streaming to us now because we're going to talk to them by radio. Because what at least the acknowledgement is that we are losing the information war here. We are getting crushed on the information side of this but how do the Taliban do it? They put two dudes on a motorcycle and they drive from village to village, and that's how they communicate to people. And but the amount of money that probably went into that, and in a way it was then characterized as a success when it was nothing more than just a hulk of metal sitting on the top of a hill someplace now. That's all you did. So you built this monument to waste and corruption and ineffectiveness. And so over and over again those stories occurred, but people made a ton of money. So I think those people, they're careerists, they're opportunists who rather yes men, yes women, or they saw the go along to get along type of thing. Or for those in the U.S. military and the U.S. government, the CIA, the State Department, what have you, you're going to spend 6 months or a year working on this war, and then you can forget about it. If you're in the CIA, you can go back to focusing on China or whatever. You're in the State Department, you can go back to, you go back to your assignment in Brazil. You're only temporarily in Afghanistan, and if you're in the military, what you do is you say, well, I'm not a policy person. I execute policy. I don't make policy. This is above my pay grade. I'm just concerned about getting my soldiers home alive. All those excuses, again, all those lies, those justifications, those rationalizations that, taken en masse, allow these wars to be sustained and propelled. And, exactly. And the result then is, of course, is 40 some odd years of war for Afghanistan, and the Taliban are in charge.